Did you hear about the largest GST scam in ATO history that has landed more than 100 people in jail up to this point in time? Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you briefly about that case, tell you the difference between a GST fraud and a GST error. I'll also talk about 3 common mistakes that we see here in our practice in relation to GST. And if you stick around to the end, I'll just teach you quickly about what can be done once you identify a GST error. So this GST fraud case, how big was it? It was $4.6 billion, which is a massive number. And because that number is so big, most people would assume that it was a really sophisticated GST fraud case, but it was actually something so simple. And what had happened was there was a guy on TikTok that said there is a money hack where you can just register an ABN for a fake business and then claim a large GST credit. So a lot of people did that, and that's resulted in, like I said before, 4.6 billion in claims. And the ATO actually paid out more than $1.2 billion before they sort of caught wind of this fraud case. Since then, they have identified 56,000 different instances where people have tried to defraud them using this same sort of method. So that's something you don't want to mess around with. 100 people have been arrested to date, but they are still working through the case and there'll be more and more people getting in trouble. So you want to avoid that at all costs. So then, what is the difference between GST fraud and making a GST error? So what is GST fraud and how is that different to a GST error? So GST fraud is the use of dishonestly using deception to get a financial gain. So that's basically making up things to get a financial benefit. So you want to stay well clear of that. Whereas the GST error, all the GST error is accidentally making a mistake on your business activity statements or when you input your data into your software. And as long as it's an honest mistake, there's not too much to worry about. And it is very common because you need to be aware on every single transaction that you get the GST right. So don't freak out if that's the case. So now let's talk about 3 common GST mistakes that we see here at our practice. So first, on the income side of things, we often see people that may have a business vehicle or a business asset and they sell that privately, like rather than to another business. And what happens there is they often forget to charge a GST when it's a sale to a, just a third party privately. So they may list their vehicle or asset on something like Facebook Marketplace or Gumtree and they'll just sell it for $20,000 without considering GST. When we identify those errors, then we have to take that GST amount or that full amount, let's say $20,000 for a car, we have to take that as the gross amount and then take the GST out of it so that they will then have to repay the ATO roughly $1,800 if they didn't declare that properly on their business activity statement. So a second error that we see commonly is GST on contractors. And this is especially prevalent with people in the building and construction industry, where they've probably set something up in their software where every payment that goes through the contractor sort of account code will just have a GST code in it. And a lot of the times we see there are some contractors that are not registered for GST. So they may be smaller contractors that think they're going to earn less than $75,000 for the year. But if your software is coding them as GST, then you are overclaiming GST on your BASs. And when that's identified, you will then have to repay that GST to the tax office because you've claimed more than you should. So just be careful with every GST contractor that you have. Make sure that they actually are registered for GST and account for that accordingly in your software. And thirdly, what we see often with the increase in e-commerce and people being able to import goods by themselves is GST on imports. So how GST on imports works is when you purchase the goods from overseas, there's generally no GST on that purchase of the product. But when that product comes through customs, they will assess the dutiable value of that asset, and then they will charge you what they believe is the GST on those goods. So what we often see is when people purchase the item in their software, they would put it through with a GST on expenses code. So they'll claim GST on the initial purchase when there actually is none. And then they will also make that same error when the customs invoice comes through. So to avoid that, you will need to set up some extra steps in your software to capture that GST on the customs invoice and ensure that you don't claim GST on the purchases when they are from overseas. So that's 3 very common errors that we see. Of course, there's way more than that, but they are common ones that we see and usually of a higher sort of value. So it's something to really keep an eye on. Now, lastly, what do you do once you identify a GST error? So what we can do there is 2 things. One, you may need to amend a prior period BAS, or on the other hand, depending on the size of the GST error, the timing of it, and the turnover of your business, you may be able to make that GST adjustment on a current or future BAS. So there are 2 types of GST adjustments that the ATO talks about, and one is a debit adjustment. And what they mean by that is where in error you've actually overpaid GST. So with a debit GST adjustment, where you'll be claiming back more GST from the ATO because you've overpaid in the past, you have up to 4 years from the original BAS due date to lodge that on the current period BAS. With the credit GST adjustment, where you have underpaid the ATO and you need to repay more, then there are different sort of time limits around that, and that will depend on your turnover. So if your turnover is less than $20 million and the GST adjustment is less than $10,000, you have up to 18 months from when the original BAS due date was to amend your current period BAS. Otherwise, you will have to go back and amend the prior period BAS in the actual quarter that the adjustment or the error was made. So if you do come across GST errors, or you need a bit of help with anything around GST, feel free to click on one of the links around the video, give someone in our team a call, and we'll talk about what issues you have and how we can rectify it.